Hello, Brobs. This is the next installment of Three Loves of Dostoevsky by Marc Slonim, a 1955 biography on the loves of Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is part one, I guess, chapter 8. This is probably the last chapter I'm going to read for a good month or so because I'm moving into Black History Month, which I'm going to read some black fiction and a book on black banking if I can get through them all in whatever 28 or 29 days. Is this leap year? I have no clue. I don't even know what year this is. 1925. Yeah, we're in 1925. All right, we're just going to go on with this. 8. Wrangels coming to Semipalatinsk in the winter of 1854 seemed a gift of fate to Dostoevsky, despite an air of coldness and aloofness, which he found quite helpful in his administrative career. The young prosecutor was an exceedingly kind and responsive individual, and of a romantic disposition. A year after making Wrangel's acquaintance, which turned into a close friendship, perhaps the only one in Dostoevsky's life, he was more frank with Wrangel in speech and correspondence than with anybody else, and this, for many years, Fyodor characterized him in a letter to Michael, a very young, very mild man with a strongly developed point d'honneur. I don't know how to say that. Unbelievably kind, a little proud, but that's just put on. I like that. A little given to the shortcomings of youth, educated, but neither brilliantly nor profoundly, likes to study, his character very weak, femininely impressionable, hypochondrial, and rather apprehensive, things which would move another man to rancor and fury make him feel hurt. The sign of a splendid heart. To this, it must be added that he had become sincerely attached to Dostoevsky, and immediately after his coming, he began to help the writer with all the ardor of youthful idealism. He introduced Fyodor to the military governor, Spiridonov, and from that time on, the exiled former convict began to be received in the homes of the town notables. This raised Dostoevsky's social prestige a great deal. He was shortly promoted to the rank of non-commissioned officer, and his living conditions improved considerably. He now had more leisure and the opportunity to use it in his own way. He could talk to Wrangel with perfect frankness, and when the Baron, in his turn, fell in love with a married woman in Barnaul who had several children and was mercilessly flirting with him, the talk of the two friends turned into a frank meeting of hearts. The young prosecutor listened patiently as Dostoevsky extolled Maria. She is kind, charming, graceful, superbly magnanimous. She is a pretty little thing, educated, very clever. Wrangel was not only the friend and confidant, but was active in assisting Dostoevsky as well. He liked to play a part in all the involvements of this love affair, where new complications were an almost daily occurrence. Early in 1855, Maria at last responded to Dostoevsky's love. Whether this was simply a moment of casual intimacy or whether their relations had turned into a real attachment, it is hard to say. They had, at any rate, drawn nearer to each other, but hardly had he come to believe that Maria returned his feelings and, as he wrote, had given him proofs of love when Isiev was appointed assessor to Kuznets, some 500 miles from Semipalatinsk. To top it all off, it was Dostoevsky who had to get the money so that they could leave. Isiev did not have a kopeck and naturally turned to the best friend of the family. Dostoevsky, of course, had no money of his own. He borrowed some from the never-failing Wrangel and handed it over to Maria. In the spring of 1855, Wrangel rented a summer residence in the neighborhood of Semipalatinsk, and since Dostoevsky's battalion had been transferred to summer quarters nearby, the non-commissioned officer managed to live for weeks on end at the house of his hospitable friend. When the Isiev's family finally set out for Kuznetsk. In June of the same year, they made a stop at Wrangel's place to say goodbye. The host served champagne and did not find it particularly hard to make Isiev drunk, and put him in the tarantass, peacefully asleep. In the meantime, Fyodor and Maria made their way to the garden. According to the Baron's testimony, at the moment of departure, the lady herself was overcome by her feelings for Dostoevsky. The lovers embraced, murmured a few words, and held hands as they sat on a bench under the shady trees. The driver, however, was insistent that his fare should start at once. It was imperative to leave. Fyodor, his eyes brimming with tears, saw Maria to the tarantass. I don't know how to say that. Is it tarantass? In which Isiev was snoring. A last kiss. The driver swung his whip. The horses dashed away when the tarantass, I don't know what it is, had disappeared in a cloud of white dust. Fyodor still stood and watched the road that disappeared among the pines. Seeing the painful emotions of his friend, Wrangel tried his best to divert him. The country house had an enormous garden, the care of which was entrusted to the two pretty daughters of Dostoevsky's landlady. These lively girls brought not a little laughter and gaiety, and perhaps even something more, into the menage of the two young men. News of the flowers cultivated in the villa garden spread through Semipalatinsk, and the local young ladies of fashion, for whom Wrangel had no particular liking, took to calling. Dostoevsky helped his host to discourage them. He was very downhearted, was forever mooning. The hell's mooning? Is that like mourning? Like a schoolboy about the bench. When Maria and he had parted, where Maria and he had parted, and kept muttering something. He had a habit of talking to himself. He was, to quote Wrangel, in ecstasies over Maria, and was constantly repeating how remarkable she was, and expressed astonishment that such a woman had been able to respond to his love. He considered himself hardly worthy of her notice, but was always writing to her, although he had to restrain himself because of her husband. Taking into account how badly I feel without you, he wrote her shortly after her departure, I judge thereby the strength of my devotion. You wrote that you are upset and even ill. My God, come, do you deserve such a lot? All these cares and annoyances you might want to serve as an ornament to any society? You are an amazing woman, with an amazing heart, a child's goodness, like one's own sister, a woman's heart, a woman's sympathy, infinite goodness. I have found all these in you. I now live all alone. I have absolutely nowhere to go. He actually was in a tragic mood and paid no attention to the flirtatiousness of the young and pretty Marina O., the daughter of a transported Pole, whom he was tutoring. The pupil, lively, energetic, and somewhat harum-scarum, was not indifferent to her teacher, especially when she found out that he had a love affair with another woman. Maria was duly informed about Marina and was very jealous of her. Whenever Dostoevsky's mood improved, he declaimed. He liked to read aloud, especially the poems of Pushkin, or walk the girls about the garden, or held endless conversations with Wrangel. By now a number of people in his circle had learned about his love, and they decided to help by arranging for him to meet Maria in secret somewhere between Semipalatinsk and Kuznetsk, since a non-commissioned petty officer ran great risks in leaving town without official permission. Besides, he was still under police surveillance. Letters to him were censored, and his own letters were forwarded to the addresses in Russia through Section 3, the Russian secret police of the period. A near conspiracy was formed. Dostoevsky claimed to be ill. A friendly doctor certified that he had to spend a few days in bed, but meanwhile, the supposed patient was racing to Zemiev, about 110 miles from Semipalatinsk. On horses furnished by his friends, it can hardly be doubted that Wrangel took part in this plot. At Zemiev, however, a frightful disappointment awaited him. Instead of Maria herself, he found a letter from her informing him that, owing to changed circumstances, she had been unable to leave Kuznetsk. Without even pausing to rest, he at once started back for Semipalatinsk. The changed circumstance turned out to be the last illness of Isiev. Toward the end of July, his condition became hopeless. He died in a fortnight. Dostoevsky learned of this on the 14th of August, 1855, from a letter of Maria's telling him how her husband had blessed her and their son before dying, as a Christian should, and describing everything that had happened, as well as the state of her own spirits, in rather trite and rhetorical phrases. She had been left without any means and did not know what to do. Dostoevsky immediately sent her 25 rubles, all he had, and turned to Wrangel, who was at that time in Barnaul on official business. Fyodor begged his friend in the name of all the saints to come to the aid of the poor widow. Her situation really was critical. She found herself alone in a strange town, without means, without relatives and friends, and burdened by a young son. Isiev's death, on the other hand, changed Dostoevsky's position a great deal. He no longer had to keep his love a secret, and at once asked Maria to marry him. He was guided not only by the desire to help her, to regulate the relations, and by a consciousness of his passionate love. My God, what a woman this is. It is a pity you know her so little, he had written Wrangel. He was also strongly drawn to married life, just not to the married life of others. There is nothing in the world superior to domestic happiness, he had written Michael. On being released from penal servitude, the family life of his parents appeared to him unsullied and happy, while his own childhood was his best and purest recollection. To have a family of his own, it seemed to him, would be a return to that golden time which, after all his tribulations and misfortunes, he willingly idealized. Also, from his 17th year, he had not had a corner he could call his own. He dreamt of marriage. As of a serene haven, he had visions of domestic comfort, of feminine solicitude, marriage with Maria, a marriage of warm, genuine love promised to resolve all his problems and to arrange not only the material but the sentimental and sexual aspects of his life. Maria naturally had different views on all this. In answer to the ardent letters of her lover, who insisted on a definite and immediate decision, she wrote that she was sad, despairing, and did not know what action to take. Dostoevsky understood that the chief obstacle to the disposition of our fate, as she called their proposed marriage, was his personal insecurity. His social position was unenviable. He was a non-commissioned petty officer in a battalion of the line, an ex-convict, deprived of his status as one of the gentry, under surveillance of the police, and under suspicion of the authorities. Ahead of him were 3 more years of military service, and after that he was faced with absolute uncertainty. Maria could form no judgment concerning his talent as a writer. She had seen no new works of his, while the success of Poor Folk had been scored 10 years before. No one could say with assurance whether he would ever be granted permission to publish his writings, and access to European Russian was for the first time being barred to him. He had no means. He had to exist on the small sums his relatives sent him. How, then, could he start a family? True, prospects for the Petrushevists seemed brighter after the death of Nicholas I and the ascent to the throne of Alexander II in March 1855. Dostoevsky was now writing letter after letter to his relatives and friends, pleading with them to exert themselves toward getting him promoted in the army and securing permission for him to publish his works. At times, when he informed her of his attempts to conquer destiny, Maria took heart and was ready to give her consent to the marriage, only to lose faith again in a short while. Her temperament was not remarkable for constancy. Her father was sending her money from Astrakhan, and she could get along somehow while waiting for the modest pension coming to her as the widow of a government official. But she was frequently ailing. Her ill health, a forerunner of consumption, made her irritable. In turn, she made life miserable for Dostoevsky by suspicions and jealousy. Why did she have to believe him after 10 months of separation? For all she knew, he was carrying on with Marina, or was sleeping with one of his landlady's daughters. As for all those girls from merchant families whom he was tutoring in mathematics, surely they must have tried to turn his head. And Maria decided to test his love. Toward the very end of 1855, Dostoevsky received an odd letter from her. She asked an impartial answer from him as a friend. Suppose somebody elderly but kind and financially secure were to appear and propose to her. On reading this, Dostoevsky staggered and fainted away. When he recovered, he told himself in despair that Maria was getting ready to marry somebody else. There was nothing impossible about this. He had learned in roundabout ways that certain old busybodies in Kuznets were doing their utmost to find some reliable person who would make a good husband for the poor widow. True, in the same letter, Maria assured him of her love, but he took her words as evidence of her kindness, of a desire to console him. His nerves were so strained by the long separation and all the uncertainty that the thought of possibly losing Maria overwhelmed him altogether. After passing a night in sobs and torments, he wrote Maria in the morning that he would die if she left him. Great is the joy of love, he wrote Wrangel about this episode, but its pangs are so horrible that it would be better not to love. I swear to you, I am thrown into despair. I hardly understand what people are saying to me and how I am living. I have a fixed idea in my head. Shortly before he had begun a comic novel, The Hamlet of Stepan Chikovo, but the work was not making any headway. One circumstance, one incident, which he had been slow about coming into my life, at which at last has befallen me, has carried me off and swallowed me whole, he wrote to Maikov in January 1856. I was happy and could not work. Then sorrow and woe came upon me. I have lost everything that constituted everything for me. I was separated by hundreds of miles. I could not write. Maria's hesitation, which was driving Dostoevsky mad and feeding his most monstrous doubts, was due to a variety of reasons. She was not sure herself whether to marry. She hesitated out of practical consideration, and besides, if afforded her pleasure, to feed her power over a man who was in love with her, and so genuine feelings were here combined with a game. Playing a game of any sort was, however, out of the question for Dostoevsky. He loved with all the force of a belated first love, with all the ardor of novelty, all the passion and excitement of a gambler who has staked everything on one card. His sleep was haunted by nightmares, and tears choked him. Waiting for a letter from Kuznets was an ordeal. When it did come at last, it was either disappointment or an outburst of new doubts and suspicions. He knew that Maria was weak and trusting, and he was apprehensive of the influence of others upon her. One can make her believe anything on earth. He knew also that she was irritable and big-hearted, meaning that she was likely to yield to anybody's blandishments. Everybody perceived her weakness and gentleness, but he knew her as others who saw her never did. It was she of whom he wrote subsequently in The Humiliated and Wronged. Melancholy gripped my heart when I made out those gaunt, wan cheeks, the lips parched and in a fever, and the eyes glinting from under their long, dark lashes with a febrile glow and a certain passionate resolve. But perhaps it was someone else who had been able to kindle this febrile glow. He was jealous, and even while she had been in semi-penitence, he annoyed her by scolding her for every glance she cast on some other man. But Maria, who was sickly and suspicious, was even more jealous of her lover. She suspected of him having an affair with every woman he met. In 1856, during Shrovetide, Dostoevsky had many invitations to parties and danced with the ladies. Despite a certain unwieldiness, he was an excellent dancer and loved to dance. He himself wrote to Maria about these innocent diversions, but she imagined the worst and decided to make him suffer in return. Hints about suitors for her hand and secret aspirants for her favors again appeared in her letters. This tragic comedy of errors went on until April, when Maria had to admit that she had been playing a game. The Kuznetsk matrons had suggested a prospective husband to her, and she had let them know that she had already had someone in mind. Word of this reached Dostoevsky, and once more he was thrown into despair. It turned out, however, that the man she had in mind was none other than himself. Don't believe it. Nevertheless, she did not discard the myth of marrying some elderly and wealthy suitor, and whenever she wrote to Dostoevsky about her ardent love for him, she did not fail to mention, as for marrying anybody, it would be only out of practical considerations. Don't believe her. Dostoevsky in the end came to the conclusion that Maria, because of her weak character, was in the same situation as Barbara, the heroine of Poor Folk, who had decided to marry the landowner, Bykov, to escape poverty and not to ruin Makar. I certainly have been a prophet of doom for myself, Dostoevsky complained in one of his letters, but Barbara had no family, whereas Maria did have to think about her son. Doubtlessly, things were not easy for her, but Dostoevsky had exaggerated her straitened circumstances when he had written Wrangel that she did not have a kopeck, and borrowed right and left to send her money. Immediately after Isiev's death, her father sent her 300 rubles, a by no means small sum in those days, and he helped her regularly later on. Dostoevsky had to admit subsequently that she did not lack for anything. His personal affairs were in a far worse state. He was chronically in debt. His living quarters were beggarly. He was still a subordinate in the army. Most excruciating of all, although he was living chiefly on hopes, he was in constant dread of some catastrophe that would deprive him of Maria. In his letters to Wrangel, who at this time had gone to St. Petersburg and in his turn was in torments over Catherine Herngross, the lady of his heart, whom he had left in Barnaul, he exclaimed, I will perish if I lose my angel. Either I'll go out of my mind or will drown myself in the Irtish. Yet to win her once and for all, he had to make sure of enough external security to armor himself against any well-to-do rivals in Kuznetsk. Security occupied his thoughts and was the theme of all the letters he wrote at the time. At the minimum, his program called for his transfer from military service to some salaried post in the civil service, as well as a certain sum to tide him over until his appointment. Dostoevsky was now dreaming of becoming a government clerk of the 14th grade. That is, one of those wretched quill drivers he had drawn in Poor Folk and the Double. The best solution, of course, would be to receive permission to publish his writings. Everything would work out then, for the main point is that no one knows either my powers or the extent of my talent. Yet these are what I am mainly relying upon. This phrase gives him away. He could have wished for a clerkship only during his hours of utter despair. Actually, he had one insupportable longing to see himself in print, to earn his living through literary work, to pick up his pen once more. That pen which had been taken away from him when he was first imprisoned in 1849, which had been withheld from him through the years of his penal servitude, and which was finally restored to him after a great deal of trouble, since he was still a soldier in a God-forsaken Siberian garrison. After all, I'm not going to marry right off, but shall wait for something that offers security. As for her, she'll gladly wait a while, as long as she has hopes that my future will be securely arranged. And one after another, the letters go winging from Semipalatinsk to St. Petersburg. To General Todtleben, to wrangle to important people in the government, to his friends, his relatives, as always, he forms the most fantastic projects. Should he write to Maria's father to make him shoo his daughter's suitors away, or address a petition to the Tsar, or turn to the generals who knew him in the School of Engineering days? He twists and turns, and according to his nature, becomes excited and exaggerates things. The petty details of daily life assume frightening aspects in his imagination. Obstacles turn into nightmares. His writing also worries him a good deal. It is very hard to get on with it. By the time he was released from penal servitude, Dostoevsky had practically forgotten how to write. On the events of the year 1854, the verses which he composed in May of that year had an obvious intent to prove his patriotic and loyal feelings. In the poem, he rumbles along against the French and English who are coming forward to defend the Turks against Christ, and glorifies the Tsar of all Russia's, God's anointed and defender of the faith. The literary value of this work is negligible. Later, after the Isievs had left Semipalatinsk, Dostoevsky at last buckled down to prose, and for a long stretch had to overcome that stiffness, amounting almost to petrifaction, so familiar to painters, writers, and other artists after a period of inactivity. He was making a laborious comeback to the point where he had been overtaken by the catastrophe 7 years before. Maria's letters during May 1856 again sounded disquieting notes. She either wrote that she was sad and pining, or suddenly announced, "We have suffered too much, have been too unfortunate to dream of marriage. She was not the one to make him happy. It would be best to forget, to renounce everything." The only thing she asked of him was to do something for Pasha. The boy was going on 9. He must be placed in some private institution of learning. Exhausted by all this correspondence with its alternations of hot and cold, Dostoevsky decided on an extreme measure. He must see Maria personally. He had to talk things over with her and clear up everything. And that meant he had to go to Kuznetsk. After a great deal of trouble and all sorts of dodges, he managed to enlist the aid of his battalion commander, who was well aware of the unhappy course of his love. Dostoevsky, as a non-commissioned officer, was assigned to deliver a wagon load of ropes to Barnaul, and Kuznetsk was not so far away. He set out on his long trip, hoping to see and embrace Maria in a few days. And that's the end of chapter 8, and that's the end of this book for a while, unless I happen to read something before I go to work tomorrow. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.